Tonight, we're stepping softly into the shadows of the Middle Ages, a world of castles, cathedrals, and countless mysteries that puzzled historians for centuries. But recent discoveries have begun to peel back the veil, revealing secrets once thought lost forever. From forgotten manuscripts to ancient diseases, from hidden treasures to strange plagues, these medieval riddles are slowly giving up their truths. So, get comfortable, let your mind drift, and let's journey together through these stories of the past, told slowly and gently. Perfect for history lovers, and perhaps for those seeking a little rest. Before we begin, take a moment to support this channel. If you enjoy calm history storytelling, please like the video, subscribe for more journeys into the past, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? The story of Vinland begins in the sagas, those ancient Norse tales told by firelight and eventually written down centuries after the voyages they describe. The sagas speak of brave men like Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who sailed westward beyond Greenland and stumbled upon a new and strange land. This land, they said, was rich in timber, abundant in wild grapes, and warmer than the harsh landscapes of Iceland or Greenland. It was a place unlike the frozen north, and so they called it Vinland, the land of wine. For hundreds of years, Vinland remained less a place on a map and more a ghost in the collective imagination. Scholars debated whether it was real or a myth invented to glorify the Norse seafarers. Was it somewhere in Newfoundland, perhaps on the coast of Canada, or was it simply an embellished story of Greenland dressed up with dreams of fertile fields and flowing wine? The mystery persisted, tucked away in the yellowed pages of the sagas. But in the 20th century, the fog uncertainty began to lift. Archaeologists Helga and Anna Steiner Ingstad travelled along the northern coast of Newfoundland, guided partly by the old tales and partly by local stories of grassy mounds that seemed too deliberate to be natural. In 1960, their search brought them to Lance O Meadows, a windswept site that revealed something extraordinary. Beneath the soil were the unmistakable remains of Norse-style buildings, longhouses with turf walls, workshops, and evidence of ironworking. Here, at last, was proof that the Vikings had not only ventured far west, but had also left behind a settlement, fragile, yet undeniable. Vinland was no longer a myth. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. For centuries, Columbus had been celebrated as the European discoverer of the New World, but the remains at Lance O Meadows showed that Norsemen had crossed the Atlantic almost 500 years earlier. These were not fleeting visitors, but settlers who built, farmed, and worked iron in the soil of North America. Yet the mystery of Vinland was not entirely solved. The sagas described lands teeming with grapes, salmon-filled rivers, and lush forests, images that did not perfectly match the windy, harsher conditions of Newfoundland. Some historians suggested that the sagas may have exaggerated or combined memories of several voyages. Others believed that the Norse travelled further south, perhaps to the warmer shores of New Brunswick or even New England, where wild grapes truly grew in abundance. The debate continues, and with it, the quiet allure of Vinland as both a place and a legend. Modern science has added more clues. In 2021, researchers analyzed wooden artifacts from Lance O Meadows and used tree ring dating to pinpoint the year the Norse were there. Astonishingly, the analysis showed that Vikings were cutting wood in Newfoundland in the year 1021. T has provided, for the first time, a precise year for the Norse presence in North America, anchoring the sagas' whispers in the bedrock of history. The sagas themselves speak of skirmishes with the indigenous peoples, whom they called Skraelings. These encounters were tense and sometimes violent, a reminder that Vinland was not an empty land waiting to be claimed, but a place already home to people with their own traditions and ways of life. The Norse settlements were short-lived, likely abandoned within a decade or two. The reasons remain murky: conflict, distance from home, and the difficulty of sustaining trade across such a vast ocean may all have played a part. Still, even in their brevity, these voyages reveal a stunning truth about the Middle Ages. At a time when Europe was seen as a world bounded by its own seas, the Norse were quietly bridging oceans, linking continents, and writing chapters of history that would not be rediscovered for centuries. What remains at Lance O Meadows is simple: turf walls, post holes, iron slag, but the quiet presence of those ruins continues to whisper of journeys that reshaped the edges of the known world. To walk there today is to feel the wind that carried longships across the North Atlantic, and to stand in the place where myth turned into history. The mystery of Vinland has not entirely dissolved. New evidence continues to emerge, from genetic traces suggesting Norse and indigenous contact, to theories that other Norse outposts may yet lie hidden beneath forest or soil along the coasts of North America. Each discovery brings us closer to understanding the reality behind the sagas, yet also reminds us of how much remains unknown. In this way, Vinland continues to occupy that liminal space between history and legend, a place half glimpsed through the mists of time. And for those seeking to rest as they listen to the past unfold, Vinland offers a gentle reminder. History is not always fixed. Sometimes it drifts like a ship at sea, anchored in fragments of wood, in old tales, and in mysteries that only slow time lie surrender their truths. The story of the Knights Templar begins in the early 12th century, when a small band of warriors pledged themselves to both the sword and the cross. They were created to protect pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads to the Holy Land, yet within decades they had become one of the most powerful and enigmatic orders in medieval Europe. Their white mantles emblazoned with a red cross became symbols of faith, wealth, and secrecy. They were monks and soldiers, bankers and builders, feared and admired in equal measure. But what has lingered most in the imagination of later centuries is the mystery of their treasure, a fortune whispered to be hidden away when the order was suppressed, a wealth that may never be found. For generations, tales of Templar riches spread across Europe. It was said they possessed not only gold and silver, but relics of immense power, perhaps the Holy Grail itself or fragments of the true cross. The Templars' financial network stretched from England to Jerusalem, and kings themselves borrowed money from them. Yet in 1307, the fortunes of the order turned. On a cold October morning, King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to the Templars, ordered their arrest. Accusations of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rituals followed. Many of the knights were tortured into confessions, their order dissolved, and their leaders burned at the stake. But what became of their immense wealth? That is where the mystery deepens. Official records tell us little. Much of the Templars' property was seized by the crown or handed over to the Hospitallers, another military order. Yet stories soon spread that wagons loaded with treasure slipped out of Paris on the eve of the arrests, vanishing into the night. Some claimed the Templars carried their hoard to the coast, loading it onto ships that sailed from La Rochelle, never to be seen again. Froze. In that moment, legends flourished. Some whispered that the Templar fleet reached Scotland, where sympathetic lords sheltered them, and that their secrets became entwined with the myths of Rosslyn Chapel. Others suggested that their ships crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus, bringing not only wealth but sacred relics to hidden shores. For centuries, seekers of mysteries and fortunes have searched for traces of the Templars' hidden legacy. Treasure hunters scoured remote sites, from the dungeons beneath French castles to the windswept shores of Nova Scotia, where the famous Oak Island mystery is often linked to them. In popular imagination, the Templars became guardians of eternal secrets, protectors of holy objects, and keepers of knowledge that might have rewritten history. Yet, as with many medieval tales, the line between fact and fable is blurred. The true treasure of the Templars may not have been gold at all, but the intricate financial system they developed. They pioneered methods of banking that allowed pilgrims to deposit funds in one city and withdraw them in another, a system that shaped the future of European finance. Their hidden wealth, then, was not only material, but intellectual, lying in the creation of networks that made them indispensable to kings and merchants alike. Still, the allure of lost gold and relics remains difficult to shake. In recent years, historians have pored over archival documents, piecing together fragments of the order's demise. Some records suggest that the scale of the Templars' riches may have been exaggerated, that much of their apparent fortune was tied up in land and property rather than hidden vaults of coin. Others note that the secrecy of the order, combined with its sudden fall, fueled the imagination of those left to wonder. To this day, the idea of a lost Templar treasure continues to capture storytellers, novelists, and seekers of hidden truths. What remains certain is that the Templars themselves became a kind of treasure, a legend that outlived their order. Their dramatic fall, their secrecy, and their enduring symbols ensured that they would not fade quietly into history. Even now, 700 years later, the image of the Red Cross on white cloth conjures thoughts of mystery, of buried chests, of relics guarded by knights sworn to silence. Whether or not the Templars hid great wealth is almost beside the point. The mystery itself has become the treasure, passed down through centuries, a riddle that invites us to imagine, to dream, and perhaps to drift into sleep while wondering what truths lie beneath the legends of the Middle Ages. Few events in medieval history cast as long and as dark a shadow as the Black Death. It arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century and swept across the continent with a speed and devastation that left chroniclers struggling to put into words the scale of the catastrophe. Entire villages were emptied, cities fell silent, and the rhythm of daily life fractured. Death carts rolled through streets, churchyards overflowed, and families were torn apart. By the time the great pestilence receded, perhaps 1/3 or even half of Europe's population had perished. For centuries afterward, the memory of the plague haunted Europe, shaping art, religion, and society. Yet one of the enduring mysteries has always been its origin. Where did the Black Death come from, and how did it spread so swiftly? For generations, explanations were shaped more by fear and superstition than science. Many medieval people believed the disease was a punishment from God, unleashed upon a sinful world. Others suspected poisonous mists or malevolent alignments of the planets. There were darker theories too, as fear turned to scapegoating, and Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to violence and persecution that compounded the tragedy. The real culprit, however, remained hidden, a mystery too. Had endured for centuries. As time passed and science advanced, the search for answers narrowed. By the late 19th century, a clearer picture began to emerge. In 1894, a bacterium named Yersinia pestis was identified in Hong Kong during another plague outbreak. This tiny organism, carried by fleas that lived on black rats, seemed to hold the key. Could this same pathogen have been responsible for the devastation of the 14th century? Many believed so, but doubts lingered. The symptoms described in medieval texts, boils, blackened skin, fever, and sudden death, did match plague, but there were also differences. Some accounts spoke of a disease that spread far more quickly, leaping from person to person in ways that seemed inconsistent with flea-borne transmission. The debate grew heated among historians and scientists. Some argued that the Black Death must have been caused by a different disease entirely, perhaps anthrax, or even an unknown viral hemorrhagic fever. Others held firmly to the plague theory, convinced that the old accounts and modern science could be reconciled. For years, the question remained unresolved, a puzzle that lay at the crossroads of medicine, archaeology, and history. Then, in recent decades, new tools brought fresh clarity. Advances in genetics allowed scientists to extract and analyze ancient DNA from the remains of plague victims buried in medieval cemeteries. In the teeth and bones of those long-dead, fragments of Yersinia pestis were found. At last, the mystery began to unravel. The Black Death was indeed caused by the plague bacterium, its terrifying power unleashed in waves across Europe. Yet this was not the whole story. Further analysis revealed that the strain of Yersinia pestis, responsible for the 14th century outbreak, was a particular branch of the bacterium's family tree, one that seemed especially virulent. It was not simply ratting and fleas, but also human-to-human transmission through respiratory droplets that helped the disease spread with such ferocity. This discovery helped explain the speed of the Black Death and why it seemed different from later plagues. It also shed light on its global origins. Genetic studies traced the roots of the pandemic back to Central Asia, to the great steppe lands where plague bacteria had long existed in rodent populations. Trade routes, like the Silk Road, acted as highways for the disease, carrying it westward along with merchants and travelers. From caravan to ship, from port to village, the plague leapt across continents until it reached the shores of the Mediterranean and began its grim march through Europe. Even with these revelations, mysteries remain. Scholars still debate the precise pathways by which the Black Death spread. Was it introduced multiple times from Asia, or did one catastrophic outbreak ripple outward in waves? Archaeological evidence suggests that the story may be even more complex, with different strains of the bacterium emerging in different regions. What is clear, however, is that the Black Death was not merely a European tragedy, but a global event, one that reshaped entire civilizations. And so, the great riddle of the Black Death's origins has been partly solved, yet enough uncertainty lingers to keep the mystery alive. What endures most, perhaps, is the sense of fragility it revealed. In the bustling towns of medieval Europe, in the quiet fields of the countryside, life seemed certain, ordered by the rhythms of the seasons and the cycles of faith. Yet in a matter of months, that certainty was shattered by a force unseen and unstoppable. For listeners today, as they drift toward rest, the story of the Black Death reminds us that history is not only grand battles and kings, but also the invisible threads of disease, chance, and human endurance. It is a reminder, too, of how mysteries can linger for centuries, only to be solved in part by science and patience, yet never fully explained. Alchemy, in the medieval world, occupied a curious place between science, magic, and philosophy. To later generations, it became little more than the quest to turn lead into gold, a pursuit often mocked as foolish or fantastical. But in the cloisters of monasteries, in the dimly lit workshops of scholars, and in the bustling cities where manuscripts circulated, alchemy was far more than the dream of riches. It was, in its own way, an attempt to understand the hidden laws of nature, a bridge between the mystical and the material. The mystery of alchemy lies not only in its cryptic symbols and secretive texts, but also in the quiet discoveries it seeded. Discoveries that centuries later would give rise to modern chemistry. The medieval alchemists cloaked their work in metaphor. Their books spoke of the philosopher's stone, a legendary substance said to have the power to transform base metals into gold and to grant immortality through the elixir of life. Their diagrams featured suns and moons, dragons devouring their tails, and cryptic riddles that seemed designed to confuse outsiders. To the uninitiated, these writings looked like nonsense, but for those within the tradition, the language carried layers of meaning, spiritual as much as physical. Alchemy was not only about transforming metals, it was about transforming the self, purifying the soul in parallel with the crucible's fire. For centuries, the true purpose of alchemy was a mystery, and to some degree, it remained so. Were the alchemists earnest seekers of material gold, or were they philosophers using the language of metals to describe inner transformation? The answer is both. Recent scholarship has uncovered how alchemists experimented with minerals, salts, acids, and distillation techniques that would later form the backbone of scientific practice. Hidden in their coded recipes were real advances, new dyes, medicos, finesse, and techniques for refining substances. At the same time, their symbolic language reveals an equally important quest for meaning, for harmony between the material and spiritual worlds. The secrecy of alchemy fueled its mystery. Manuscripts were often written in dense allegories, meant to be understood only by initiates. Knowledge was carefully guarded, passed from master to apprentice, whispered rather than openly declared. This secrecy led outsiders to view alchemy with suspicion. The church sometimes condemned it, kings alternately supported or outlawed it, and ordinary people associated it with sorcery. Yet even as it lived on the margins of respectability, alchemy attracted some of the brightest minds of the Middle Ages. Figures like Roger Bacon, Albertus Magnus, and later Paracelsus all engaged with alchemical thought, blending it with philosophy and natural science. The mystery of what alchemists truly accomplished has only recently begun to be solved. In the archives of libraries across Europe, forgotten manuscripts have been rediscovered and carefully studied. By decoding the symbols and testing the recipes, historians of science have come to see that many alchemists were far more practical than legend suggests. They experimented with sulfur, mercury, and lead, yes, but they also pioneered methods of distillation that would later be used in medicine and brewing. Some worked with herbal compounds, laying the groundwork for pharmacology. Others studied the transformation of substances in ways that foreshadowed modern chemistry. Still, the allure of the great mystery remains. The philosopher's stone has never been found, though it has inspired centuries of speculation. Some see it as purely metaphorical, a symbol of perfection and spiritual enlightenment. Others wonder if it was a code for an actual substance or process, now lost in the veils of allegory. What is clear is that alchemy, while failing in its grand promise of eternal life and infinite gold, succeeded in keeping alive the human urge to question, to experiment, and to dream of hidden truths. Today, when we look back at the cryptic diagrams and strange recipes of medieval alchemy, it is easy to smile at the thought of men stirring bubbling cauldrons in hopes of conjuring treasure. Yet if we listen closely, there is a gentler lesson. These were people seeking to understand a world that felt filled with mystery, where the elements themselves seemed alive with secret potential. In their quiet workshops, lit by flickering lamps, they chased knowledge not with the certainty of modern science, but with wonder and patience. And though their golden stone was never found, the pathways they opened remind us that even failed quests can shape the course of history. The true treasure of alchemy may not have been gold at all, but the gift of curiosity, passed down through centuries, whispering still in the story of the Middle Ages. Among the many mysteries that shadow medieval England, few have stirred as much quiet speculation as the fate of the two young princes, Edward and Richard. Their story begins in the turbulent summer of 1483, when their father, King Edward IV, died unexpectedly, leaving his eldest son, only 12 years old, to inherit the crown. The boy was proclaimed Edward V, and with him stood his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, just 9 years old. Yet before Edward could be crowned, the wheels of power began to turn in dangerous directions. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed protector of the realm, a role meant to safeguard the young king until he came of age. But soon, whispers of ambition and suspicion clouded the air. The boys were lodged in the Tower of London, at that time not only a prison, but also a royal residence and fortress. The intention, at least in official language, was to prepare Edward for his coronation. Yet as the weeks passed, events took an unsettling turn. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, fearing for her family's safety. Parliament declared Edward's claim to the throne invalid, citing questions over his legitimacy. In a matter of weeks, Richard of Gloucester set aside his nephews and had himself crowned as Richard III. It was after this that the young princes disappeared from view. Chroniclers of the age note that they were last seen playing within the walls of the tower during the summer of 1483. After that, silence. Rumours spread quickly, rumours that the boys had been quietly murdered to secure their uncle's hold on the throne. But who carried out the deed, and whether Richard himself gave the order, has never been proven. Some accounts pointed the finger at Richard's loyal servants, while later stories accused others with motives of their own, including the ambitious Duke of Buckingham, or even Henry Tudor, who would later claim the throne as Henry VII. For centuries, the fate of the princes lingered as one of England's darkest mysteries. In 1674, workmen renovating the tower uncovered a wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the bones of two small children. King Charles II ordered them placed in Westminster Abbey, in an urn where they remain to this day, believed by many to be the remains of the princes. Yet the identification has never been confirmed. Modern calls for DNA testing have been made, but the Abbey has so far declined to disturb the urn. The disappearance of the princes is not simply a question of crime, it is a window into the fragile nature of medieval kingship. A crown could not rest securely on a child's head in an age of ambition and civil war. The Wars of the Roses had already torn England apart, and in such a climate the survival of two young heirs may have seemed a threat to those seeking stability, or power. Whether Richard III was a ruthless usurper or a man unfairly maligned by history remains a subject of debate. Shakespeare immortalized him as a villain, a schemer with a crooked back and a poisoned heart, but historians continue to argue over the truth. Some alternative theories suggest the princes may not have been killed at all. Perhaps they were smuggled out of the tower, their identities hidden, their lives spared in secret exile. From time to time, men emerged claiming to be one of the lost princes, most famously Perkin Warbeck in the late 15th century, who gathered support by presenting himself as Richard, Duke of York. Was he truly the lost boy, grown to manhood, or merely an impostor seeking advantage in turbulent times? The answer was never certain, and Warbeck met his end on the scaffold. In the centuries since, the story of the princes in the tower has become more than a historical question. It has grown into a symbol of innocence lost, of the dangers of power, and of the mysteries that lie in the silence of old stones. The tower itself, with its thick walls and cold chambers, holds countless stories of imprisonment and execution, but none more haunting than that of the two boys who played there one summer and were never seen again. As we drift through their tale, the mystery remains unsolved. Were they murdered, and if so, by whose hand? Or were they hidden, their fates lived out far from the chronicles of kings and wars? Perhaps the answer lies still beneath the stones of the tower, waiting quietly for discovery. For now, it lingers in the half-light of history, a story told and retold, not with certainty, but with wonder. And in that uncertainty lies the quiet power of the past, its ability to stir our imagination, even as it lulls us toward rest. Among the treasures that sit quietly in the libraries of the world, none whispers more strangely than the Voynich manuscript. At first glance, it looks like any other medieval codex, its pages filled with writing, its margins decorated with drawings. But a closer look reveals a book that defies explanation, a riddle that has puzzled scholars, codebreakers, and dreamers for more than 500 years. The manuscript takes its name from Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish bookseller who acquired it in 1912, yet its origins stretch far earlier. Carbon dating places its parchment in the early 1400s, around the same years that Europe was emerging from the Middle Ages. Its pages, over 200 in number, are filled with a script unlike any other language known to man. Curved letters flow across the parchment in neat, consistent lines. The symbols resemble writing, yet no one has ever managed to translate them. Alongside the mysterious script are illustrations, and here the puzzle deepens. There are drawings of plants, yet many are unlike any species known on Earth. Some look familiar, with stems and leaves shaped like herbs that could be found in a garden, while others twist into impossible forms, like dreams half remembered. There are charts that resemble astronomical diagrams, circular forms filled with stars and moons, suggesting that the book may have been meant as a kind of cosmological guide. Then there are the stranger images still. Naked women bathing in pools connected by strange tubes and channels, their bodies drawn in a style both simple and unsettling. What these figures represent is unknown. Some believe they reflect medieval medical practices, connected to health or fertility. Others see in them a symbolic language, perhaps alchemical, meant only for initiates of some hidden knowledge. Over the centuries, countless theories have been proposed. Some argue the manuscript is a coded treatise in an unknown European language, its true meaning locked behind layers of substitution ciphers. Others claim it is an elaborate hoax, a meaningless script crafted to deceive wealthy collectors. During World War II, even codebreakers working at Bletchley Park, the same minds that cracked the Enigma machine, took turns studying the Voynich manuscript, yet it yielded no answers. Modern cryptographers have tried statistical analysis, searching for patterns in the text. Strangely, the symbols do behave like a real language. There are words that repeat, structures that suggest grammar, and rhythms that resemble speech. And yet, without a Rosetta Stone, the language remains silent. A few scholars have claimed breakthroughs, offering translations that read like herbal remedies, religious poetry, or even an ancient Asian tongue, but none of these interpretations has held under scrutiny. What gives the Voynich manuscript its peculiar allure is not only that it is unreadable, but that it feels as though it should be readable. The words march across the pages with confidence, as if the author knew exactly what they meant. The drawings seem purposeful, though strange, as if revealing truths just beyond our grasp. It is this sense of meaning just out of reach that has kept people awake at night, studying its symbols, tracing its patterns, hoping for that sudden spark of understanding. And so the book rests today in the rare book library at Yale University, its pages carefully preserved, its secrets still intact. Scholars can turn its pages, scan its drawings, copy its text into computers, but the silence remains. A medieval voice calls out across 6 centuries, and though we listen, we cannot yet answer. The Voynich manuscript reminds us that history is not a straight path of progress. Some knowledge has been lost, some voices muted, some truths buried in ink that we can no longer read. It is a book that humbles us, showing that even in an age of satellites and supercomputers, there remain mysteries older than memory, waiting patiently in parchment and ink. Perhaps one day its meaning will be unlocked, and we will discover whether it was a book of medicine, a work of mysticism, or a trick played upon the ages. Until then, the Voynich manuscript continues to dream in silence, its pages like closed eyes, waiting for someone to wake them. And as we sit with it in thought, the quiet of the night deepens, reminding us that mystery too can be a kind of lullaby. Of all the figures who wander through the half-light of medieval legend, none is more familiar or more elusive than Robin Hood. Ask anyone about the Middle Ages, and sooner or later the green-clad outlaw of Sherwood Forest will appear, bow in hand, forever stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Yet behind the ballads, the films, and the fairy tales lies a mystery that historians have never fully solved. Who, if anyone, was the real Robin Hood? The earliest stories we know of Robin Hood date to the late 14th century. In those first ballads, he is not the cheerful, noble hero of later tales, but a much rougher figure, a yeoman who lived outside the law and mocked both crown and clergy. He is shown as pious in his own way, respectful of the Virgin Mary, but quick to draw his sword or knock his arrow. These stories were sung in taverns and marketplaces, their verses simple enough to carry by memory, their rhythms meant for a lively audience. But where did those songs come from? Some scholars believe Robin Hood was a composite built from the lives of many outlaws who haunted the forests of medieval England. The records of the time are filled with names like Robert Hood, Robin Hood, or Rabban Hod, men accused of theft or rebellion. In the rolls of the courts, the name Robin Hood sometimes appears almost as a nickname for troublemakers, as though any outlaw might wear the mask. Others have sought a single figure behind the legend. Candidates range from Robert of Locksley, a rebel against King John, to various disinherited knights or local brigands whose deeds were remembered in part and embellished in song. Sherwood Forest itself, near Nottingham, was a place where the law held lightly. Its thick woods and tangled paths gave shelter to those who fled justice, whether poachers, debtors, or rebels. In such a landscape, it was easy for stories of a noble ewe, claw, to take root. The tale of Robin Hood evolved as the centuries passed. By the 16th century, he had become a gentleman, sometimes even a nobleman in disguise, fighting against the tyranny of corrupt sheriffs and greedy bishops. Maid Marian, Friar Tuck, and Little John entered the story, transforming it into a tale not of lone rebellion, but of fellowship and justice. The cruel realism of the early ballads softened into something more like a moral fable. The question of Robin Hood's reality has drawn modern historians into archives and folklore studies alike. Some argue that the name itself became a symbol of resistance, less a single person than an idea, the common man's dream of justice against corrupt power. In an age when kings levied heavy taxes, when forests were guarded by royal law, and when ordinary people lived under constant burden, the thought of a man who could strike back with bow and arrow was powerful indeed. What recent scholarship has shown is that the figure of Robin Hood may tell us more about the people who sang the songs than about any single outlaw. He reflects their frustrations, their hopes, and their humour. To the villagers who gathered around the hearth, Robin was the one who turned the tables on lords and priests, who laughed in the face of injustice, who shared bread with the poor. Whether he truly walked through Sherwood or not, he was real in the imagination, and perhaps that was what mattered most. Even today, scholars continue to sift through records, tracing names, searching for a flesh-and-blood archer behind the tales. And yet, the mystery endures. Robin Hood stands at the border of fact and folklore, a shadow that refuses to resolve into a single face. Perhaps that is why he remains so enduring. He belongs to no one age, no single village or court role. He belongs instead to the timeless longing for fairness, for laughter in dark times, for the chance that an arrow loosed from the greenwood might yet strike at the heart of tyranny. And so, as the night deepens, we might imagine the whisper of leaves in Sherwood, the creod, back of a bowstring drawn in silence, the soft footfall of an outlaw slipping through the trees. Whether man or myth, Robin Hood lingers on, a medieval mystery wrapped in song, keeping watch in the forest of memory. When we walk today into the hushed interiors of Europe's great cathedrals, it is easy to be struck by their sheer scale. Stone towers rise like mountains, arches soar toward heaven, and light pours through stained glass in colors that seem more like jewels than glass. They stand as some of the most enduring creations of the Middle Ages, built not only as places of worship, but as symbols of faith, wealth, and community. And yet, behind their beauty lies a mystery. How were such vast and intricate structures raised with the tools and knowledge of the time? In the 12th and 13th centuries, a new style of building began to spread across Europe, known today as Gothic architecture. It was marked by pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses that carried the weight of the roof outward. These innovations allowed cathedrals to climb higher and higher, their ceilings lifting like stone forests, their walls filled with light. But the exact methods by which medieval builders designed and calculated these structures remain a puzzle. No complete manuals survive, and many of the great works seem to have been built as much by intuition and experiment as by precise engineering. Take, for example, Chartres Cathedral in France. Its walls rise over 100 feet, its towers piercing the sky. Yet those who planned and built it had no modern mathematics, no computer models, no steel cranes. Instead, they relied on ropes, pulleys, wooden scaffolding, and above all, a deep understanding of stone learned through generations of masons. The precise geometry of the cathedral's windows and vaults suggests knowledge of advanced mathematics, but the records are silent on how this knowledge was passed down, Some whisper that secret guilds of builders guarded the techniques, handing them only to apprentices who proved worthy. Then there are the symbolic mysteries woven into the stone itself. Cathedrals are filled with carvings, angels, saints, demons, beasts, and strange faces that peer out from hidden corners. Some of these were meant to teach the faithful stories from scripture, for many could not read. But others seem stranger, more enigmatic, grotesques with wide mouths, or geometric patterns whose meaning is lost. Were these simply artistic flourishes, or did they encode messages understood only by the builders and clergy? Modern studies have shown that many cathedrals align with astronomical events, their windows designed to capture the sun at particular moments of the year. This suggests that builders were not only architects, but also observers of the heavens, blending faith with natural science. In Chartres, for instance, a small opening in the wall allows sunlight to fall upon a specific point of the floor during the summer solstice. Was this merely practical, or was it intended to link the church with the great cycles of the cosmos? Even the question of who truly designed these structures remains partly hidden. While the names of bishops and patrons are often recorded, the master masons themselves are sometimes anonymous, their genius preserved only in stone. Perhaps they preferred it so, seeing their work as service to God rather than to earthly fame. Or perhaps, over time, their names simply faded while the buildings endured. What has been solved, at least in part, is the practical side of the mystery. Archaeological studies and experimental archaeology have shown how teams of workers could quarry stone, transport it on sledges and boats, and raise it using treadwheel cranes, giant wooden wheels that men walked inside to lift massive blocks upward. These methods were slow, dangerous, and required enormous manpower, yet they worked, year after year, century after century. Still, when we look upward in Notre Dame, in Canterbury, Uri, in Cologne, we cannot help but feel something more than technique at work. The cathedrals are not merely feats of engineering, but expressions of something larger: faith, ambition, and an urge to touch the eternal. That feeling is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. How did people who lived with so little, by modern standards, create structures that continue to inspire awe, wonder, and even silence? As the candles flicker low and the night deepens, the stone vaults of medieval cathedrals seem to echo with centuries of voices. Monks chanting, pilgrims whispering prayers, builders calling to one another on scaffolds high above the ground. The mystery of their creation may never be fully solved, but perhaps that is fitting. For cathedrals were meant not only to reveal, but also to remind us that some truths lie beyond understanding, resting quietly in the realm of faith, shadow, and light. Long before the castles and kingdoms of the Middle Ages, there was Rome. Its legions marched across Europe, carving roads through forests, raising forts on distant frontiers, and leaving behind traces that medieval people would later stumble upon in fields and ruins. Among those legions, one in particular has captured the imagination, the Ninth Legion, known as Legio IX Hispana. Its mysterious disappearance became, in time, part of the lore that drifted through the medieval centuries, whispered as both history and legend. The Ninth Legion was once one of Rome's proudest units. It had fought in Spain, marched in Gaul, and crossed the seas into Britain, where it helped conquer the Misty Island. In the early 2nd century, records show it stationed at York, then called Eboracum, and then the trail fades. The legion vanishes from the written record, its banners no longer listed, its name erased from Rome's rolls. Later historians puzzled over this silence. Did the Ninth march north into Essaus, Scotland, into the lands of the Picts, only to be cut down in some forgotten battle? Did it travel east to face uprisings in Judea or to defend Rome's borders against Parthian armies? The truth is unclear. By the Middle Ages, the lack of certainty allowed stories to bloom. Monks copying manuscripts sometimes left small notes about Rome's lost armies, hinting at entire legions swallowed by wilderness or destroyed by God's will as punishment for pride. In the medieval imagination, the Ninth became a symbol of the limits of empire. To those living in England centuries later, the ruins of Roman roads and walls were reminders that even the mightiest power could falter. The disappearance of an entire legion, thousands of men, armed and trained, fit easily into the medieval sense that history was full of divine mysteries, lessons written in the past for the living to ponder. Modern archaeology has provided clues, though not answers. Inscriptions suggest the Ninth may have been transferred to the continent, perhaps to guard the Rhine frontier. Other fragments hint at its presence in the east, though none confirm its final fate. What has been solved is not the legion's destiny, but its endurance as a story. The mystery itself became part of the cultural memory, retold in monasteries, villages, and later in chronicles, as a tale of how even the strongest armies could simply vanish into time. For medieval minds, this was not merely a historical curiosity, but a warning. The fall of Rome was seen as a lesson in humility, and the lost Ninth Legion embodied that fall in miniature. Men who thought themselves eternal, but who became shadows. In an age when battles were fought on horseback and faith coloured every interpretation of the past, the silence of the Ninth could only mean something profound. And so, through the Middle Ages, the vanished legion remained more myth than fact, a riddle without a key. It became part of a world where history blurred with legend, where ruins on a hill might be explained as the bones of a lost army, where the unknown was allowed to breathe alongside the known. Even today, when scholars pore over fragments of stone and broken tablets, the fate of the Ninth remains uncertain, an unanswered question from the deep past. As the night stretches on, the story of the Ninth Legion reminds us of something essential, that history is not always neat or complete. Sometimes it is silence, sometimes absence, sometimes a name carved on stone, and then never again. And in that silence lies the kind of mystery that can cradle the restless mind, inviting us not to solve, but to simply drift with the thought of what might have been. Among all the strange stories whispered down to us from the Middle Ages, few are as haunting or as baffling as the tale of the dancing plague. It began, according to chronicles, on a hot summer's day in 1518 in the city of Strasbourg. A woman stepped into the street and began to dance. Not for joy, not for celebration, but with a restless, compulsive motion that she seemed unable to stop. Hours passed, and still she danced. Days passed, and she kept moving. Soon others joined her, dozens, then hundreds, until the streets themselves seemed to thrum with a rhythm no one else could hear. The people of Strasbourg were bewildered. Some thought the dancers had been cursed, others believed it was divine punishment. Musicians were even brought in at one point, their drums and fiddles meant to accompany the dancers in the hope that the frenzy might burn itself out, but the music only seemed to feed the motion. The dancers spun, leapt, collapsed, rose again. Some are said to have danced until their feet bled. A few, according to reports, danced until death. To the medieval mind, such an event could not be explained by ordinary means. Perhaps the dancers had angered a saint. Saint Vitus was often named, his cult linked to strange convulsions. Perhaps demons had taken hold of their bodies. In a world where disease and disaster were often read as signs of divine will, the dancing plague seemed another message, though its meaning was unclear. Modern scholars have searched for answers. Some suggest ergot poisoning, caused by a fungus that grew on damp rye bread. Ergot can produce hallucinations and spasms, and it has been linked to outbreaks of strange behavior. Others think the plague was psychological, a kind of mass hysteria born from hunger, fear, and the pressures of daily life. The early 1500s were years of famine, disease, and religious tension, and perhaps the dancing was an unconscious response to unbearable strain. In this view, the plague was not a punishment from above, but a cry from within. Yet the mystery remains. The records describe not a handful of isolated dancers, but entire crowds, moving in step, as if carried by something beyond themselves. No modern explanation fully accounts for the scale or the persistence of the phenomenon. And Strasbourg was not alone. Other towns and villages recorded similar outbreaks across medieval Europe, though none as famous as that of 1518. What is most unsettling is the silence that follows. The dancing plague appeared, flared, and faded, leaving behind no cure, no pattern, no certain cause. It is as though a fever passed through the air and then vanished, leaving only questions in its wake. For the people of the time, it was a sign of how fragile the boundary between order and chaos truly was. For us, it is a reminder that the human mind and body can still hold secrets, even after centuries of study. As we picture those cobbled streets filled with exhausted dancers, their movements swaying in the summer heat, we find ourselves at the edge of history and myth once more. Were they cursed, poisoned, or overwhelmed by something within themselves? We do not know. The answers are lost, just as the music they seem to hear is lost, echoing only in the imagination. And so, the dancing plague remains one of the Middle Ages' strangest legacies, a mystery that refuses to resolve, a story that resists neat explanation. It lingers in the ages of chronicles and in the quiet of our thoughts, a reminder that not every riddle of the past is meant to be solved. Some are meant simply to be remembered, turning gently in the mind like a lullaby with no ending. As our journey through these medieval mysteries draws to a close, the night feels deeper, softer, quieter. The questions remain, but perhaps that is fitting. For history, like sleep, often leaves us with unfinished thoughts, whispers, shadows, fragments of stories that trail away into silence, and it is in that silence that rest finally finds us.